Well, good afternoon, good morning, and in some cases, good evening to all of our friends and colleagues who are joining us from around the US and the world. It is truly a privilege to be able to spend some time with you all, and especially with my colleagues who are on the panel today. I'm Fanta. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of NAFSA, Association of International Educators. And I get to each and every day think about the big issues along with many, many of my colleagues. And we felt it was important for us to bring this conversation to you and to have you be part of the conversation in how we move forward and what are some of the tools that perhaps we need to sort of sharpen in our toolbox and where do we go from here. And so I'm joined by an esteemed group of panelists, and I will introduce them in terms of their name and title. But I think it's really important that for our conversation today, that you also hear the context from which they're coming, because I think that context is important for you to be able to situate the conversation. We want to give ample time for the discussion. We know that you have a lot of questions and some great questions have come in. We will not have the answers to all of them, but we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. And know that after this, this town hall, we will also have on our website, we will post resources that our colleagues were generous enough to share with us and some of our own resources within NAFSA, because I know that when we leave these conversations, we go back. Part of it is to continue, but more than conversation is to act. So this is really a call to action as well. And you need the tools to be able to do that effectively. This town hall would not have been possible without the incredible staff at NAFSA. I get to work with amazing people every single day. They're behind the scenes, but believe me, they are really the architect of all of this work that has gotten us here today. So I would be remiss if I didn't thank them, whether it's Caroline, Madeline, Lauren, and everyone else at NAFSA. Thank you for everything you do on an everyday basis and to bring the important thought leadership conversations to our members and the community of international education. With that, let me start by introducing our panelists. We have Thuy Thi Nguyen, who is basically will talk to you about the role she has taken on multiple hats. And part of the reason I really wanted to have her on the panel is that I came across some of her writing and some of sort of the framework that I thought was incredibly interesting. And I thought it would be really important for us to bring that to you all as NAFSAN. She is a lawyer, but also she's been a president. And more than anything else, she's been a staunch advocate for equity and has also lectured in lots of different places, including most recently USC Race and Equity Center, among the myriad of places that she's been. A familiar face to you all, Lily Lopez-Migui. Lily is the executive director of Diversity Abroad, an incredible organization doing really important work, where we all have the opportunity to learn a lot more. Folks who've been really trailblazer in our area of work and have challenged us to think differently and to really bring in some new paradigms. So it's exciting that Lily is with us today to share her insights and the work that they've been doing. Last but certainly not least, that you also, many of you will know and recognize, and that is Lenitra Berger. Lenitra wears multiple hats as well. Lenitra is the chair and president of NAFSA, and we get to really work with someone who is always thinking and who's always forward-looking and is always looking for the larger conversations that we can bring to bear. She also, the other hats that she wears is she's an associate professor of history and art at George Mason University, and she is the director of the African and African American Studies at George Mason University. So you will know why she's here, given the intersection of her work and what she brings to this table. With that said, one last thing. This conversation, I think for many of us, is not new. I think for many, it will come across as new, but we will remind you that in fact, we've been down this road before. And we need to be able to capitalize on the tools that have worked previously, knowing that the conditions have changed and that we're going to have to retool ourselves for sure. The other thing is, prior to coming to NAFSA, while I was at American University, I got to wear multiple hats. Among them was leading our inclusive excellence work at American University. And so the intersection of international education and DEI is certainly not new or foreign to me. And that's the hat that I will be wearing during our conversation. So without further ado, we're going to jump into it. I've asked our panelists to kind of have some framing questions and answers, but then we're going to really delve into the many questions that you've asked, and know that we'll make time for additional questions from you as an audience. And we're going to ask you to please use the Q&A box to post your questions as we move forward. Thank you to everyone. And without further ado, we're going to start with Thuy.
Well, good morning. Good morning from California. Thank you so much for the invitation to be in this virtual space with such esteemed colleagues, panelists. Thank you very much. My name is Thuy Thi Nguyen. I noticed that when you posted on Twitter the announcement of this session, you made points to have the diacritic marks of the Vietnamese name. So I will pronounce my name in Vietnamese too, Nguyen Thị Thuy. That's my name. My family and I was born in Vietnam. My family and I fled communist Vietnam when I was 3 years old. So yes, we were both people refugees. And since then, we were in Wichita, Kansas, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Oakland, California. And I know we have people from all over the country and, as you said, Fanta, all over the world on this. Speaking of the virtual stage, you've asked me to set the stage. So let me do that and set the stage in terms of what is this Supreme Court decision that was issued in during the summer. And for many of us coming back to the school year, some of us may just be catching up with this. As you know, the Supreme Court made a decision regarding race-conscious admissions, Harvard's and UNC's race-conscious admission, student admission. And one thing that I think is very critical as we talk about the Supreme Court decision, what it is and what it is not, we also need to keep in mind this notion. There was an article, and there's been some scholarship around this notion of repressive legalism. And I'll just read it directly from the scholars. What typically happens in higher ed when people are managing new legal restrictions, research shows that the swirl of dialogue can create chilling effects far beyond the law's requirements. We need to be vigilant to this tendency. They call it repressive legalism. And so this whole notion of not overreaching, not overbroad, not overreading what the decision is. So let's go into now, what is the decision? So as you know, the Supreme Court did an analysis under the Equal Protection 14th Amendment. And it's been well-established law of standard review called strict scrutiny in equal protection analysis. Whenever race or race is utilized in a race-conscious way, such as the Harvard-UNC case, the courts go through a strict scrutiny analysis. And this is sort of the way it goes through it. Compelling interest. Is there a compelling interest for you to do this work in a race-conscious way? Are there race-neutral ways to still achieve what you wanted to do with the compelling interest? And then if it's race-based or race-conscious, did you use the least restrictive means to do so? And then at a certain point, it becomes a violation. So the courts already allow for race-conscious policies, procedures, and practices, but it has to go through a rigorous strict scrutiny analysis. The first part of the analysis is compelling interest. Is what you're trying to achieve a compelling interest? And Harvard's case is Harvard and UNC was making the case that there are educational benefits to having a racially diverse student population. Well, what did the court say around that compelling interest? It says that although the goals are commendable, they are not sufficiently coherent for the purposes of strict scrutiny. And so essentially the court said it is not a compelling interest, Harvard and UNC, what you're trying to achieve with a racial diverse student body. That said, well, let me just make a side note on this one because, and this is editorial on my part. You know, when the Supreme Court said that the educational benefits of racial diversity in a student body is not compelling, it seems rather un-American to me, to be really frank. The best evidence of the value of racial diversity is Exhibit A, the United States of America itself. The country's diversity, racial, ethnic, national origin diversity, is our strength. It fuels our innovative economy. Diversity gives us cultural wealth in language, food, our colleges, universities even, and so many sectors. That cultural wealth is impressive, especially considering how relatively young the country is compared to many other countries, right? So the racial diversity has proven to be our competitive advantage in the world. And that for me and for many people, that is compelling. So I found it very unfortunate that the court decided to focus and say that that was not compelling. It seems, like I said, rather un-American to me. Nevertheless, what did the court recognize? It did recognize other compelling interests that were race conscious, even in its decision. So it's not saying no race conscious policies, procedure. In fact, it recognizes other types of race conscious policies, procedures. And here's the thing, and this goes to the chilling effect of overreading it. The court, even in a footnote, made a point to say, United States, you came in as an amicus brief type, and you made the argument that admissions into the military academies is really important to be racially diverse and to have race-conscious admissions. And the court even said to the military academy, it said, our SCOTUS decision here does not apply to you, military academy. You may be able to make sufficiently good case for why racially diverse student body at our academies is compelling, right? So if SCOTUS is saying that to the military academies about their admissions program, then don't be too rushed to say SCOTUS decision applies to many of the things that we're doing. And in fact, it doesn't apply. So I just want to use that example to just say, don't overreach and start using the Supreme Court decision to suggest things that don't even apply to the work that many of you are doing. The other is in the court decision, and many admissions officers with the ones that actually apply to them in terms of college admissions, the court did also say something that people have been holding on to, is at the same time, all parties agree nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. And so many college admissions policies right now, I'm sure a lot of the offices right now are doing some pivoting around being able to have, whether it be the main personal essay or the optional essay for students to be able to express their racial identity. I say all of this in terms of the chilling effect because we learned that lesson in California. Prop 209 was passed 25 years ago, and what resulted was an incredible chilling effect where people overread what it meant. There's no doubt it took away a huge tool for the work of racial equity. But nevertheless, Berkeley Unified School District, and I was part of the legal team that helped advise that school district on how to create its voluntary integration plan. And it was sued for violating Prop 209. And guess what? The school district won. And the court very clearly said, Prop 209 does not eliminate all race-conscious policies, plans, and procedures. So if that's a lesson from California to the country, please know, don't overread it, still lean in. Another example is people thought focus outreach was no longer allowed. And Fanta, you mentioned a report, and we'll talk a little bit later in terms of tools, but I wanted to really call out that absolutely focus outreach based on race is still allowed under the SCOTUS decision and under California's Prop 209. All right, so I hope I helped set the stage for you, Fanta, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you. You absolutely did. And I want to just invite all of us to pick up on a topic that was raised very early on that we want to kind of revisit. And that is the compelling sort of argument here, right? We make that same compelling argument for international education. We often make the argument that international education enriches the educational opportunities to everyone on our campuses, and that having international students on our campuses really allow for that. So they're parallel to how we've been in conversation and the discourse we've been having about the value proposition of whether it's international education or diversity and equity in our educational system. So I just didn't want to lose that. And the other piece that Tui raised as well is they've been down this road before. California with Proposition 209 went down that road. And as she mentioned, she was very instrumental in sort of helping to fight that fight. And it came back and they prevailed. So we will talk more about those pieces and why it's important for all of us to not only lean in, but to really read carefully what is in front of us because otherwise, before you know it, the pendulum is going to swing very far. And we already know that. We're seeing institutions that are now scrambling to look at their financial aid, to look at, their special programs, and the list goes on and on and on. So cautionary tale. The question that I had asked, and I'm going to ask Lily to kind of help answer, is how should our audiences make meaning of the bans on DEI and the recent SCOTUS decision? So Twee has talked to us about the SCOTUS decision, but there's also the DEI ban. And I would say this has been the perfect storm, because before this, we had the, Asian hate that had taken place. We've had so many different milestones around these issues, and this is just another perfect storm. Lily, insights on this?
Yes, and thank you, Fanta, for the invitation to join with both Twee and Lenitra today. I think the conversation will be a rich one, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to it. Before I share just a couple of thoughts orienting us around the implications of not just the SCOTUS decision and the DEI bans at the state level, I did want to offer just a brief background on who I am and what lens I'm bringing to this conversation. So my name is Lily Lopez-McGee. I currently serve as the Executive Director for Diversity Abroad, which is an association-based organization that really focuses at the intersection of exactly the topic that we're talking about: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and international education and exchange. And I currently I'm joining you from Alexandria, Virginia, which is DC parallel, right around the corner, down the street from our capital. And I'm originally from the Pacific Northwest, so hold a number of different perspectives from regional-based orientations to this conversation. I also proudly identify as a Latina, a Guatemalan American who was born abroad but grew up here in the United States. So for very many much of this work is very personal to my experience, in large part because my own experiences have been framed, and I've had several opportunities throughout my educational experience that could be couched as affirmative action and targeted programs that are aimed at racialized, minoritized populations in the United States. So while I will share with you some vantage points that are a little bit more policy oriented, know that many of my framings are coming also from a personal perspective, which as international educators, I think we can all appreciate that much of this work is also very personal, deeply personal to many of us as well. So I wanted to organize my thoughts around the 4 pillars that Diversity Abroad uses when we look at international education and exchange, because international education and exchange can encompass a number of different areas. So I wanted to focus on education abroad and study abroad, international student and scholar services, global learning at home, and organizational management and belonging, because the implications for not just the SCOTUS decision, but also for the state level policies that are coming into place could potentially have ramifications in a number of different areas around these 4 areas of international education and exchange. So if we start from the education abroad standpoint, I wanted to draw out 2. One is related to recruitment of students from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds, those students that historically have been underrepresented in study abroad. There is a very big likelihood that the number of students, much of the work that has happened over the last 2 decades to try to diversify the student population of students that are going out to international education programs outside of the United States will be harder to do, in large part because the number of students on campuses the enrollment of students from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds may be affected, particularly at institutions with highly selective admissions policies. And I emphasize this in large part because if you look at the open doors data related to study abroad, we see that many of the institutions that are the top producers or the top senders of US students abroad also tend to be highly selective institutions. So the numbers around access and diversity with regard to just access to study abroad programs could be harder to do. And we did see, as Twee mentioned, some very clear examples of how this happened in California after the implementation of Prop 209. And we see that some of these initial efforts are well underway in states where DEI bans have started to take effect as of the July 1 fiscal year. The other area for study abroad that I wanted to note was just one that came through really, I think, resonated a lot with the folks who are online with questions about scholarships and programs that are specifically focused on providing tools and resources to make study abroad more accessible. And what I would add here is that programs that have a focus on specific identity groups may come under closer scrutiny. And I want to emphasize here something that Tui said, that sometimes it's not necessarily just about the criteria, because for many of the nationally competitive awards, race is not considered a criterion for selection, but may draw more scrutiny just because of, again, interpreting or going beyond what the scope of the actual legal framework and ruling say. So I did want to emphasize that there could be an element of scrutiny here. What we've seen already is that there's been a pivot for lots of financial aid and scholarship programs to start to look at selection criteria and assess whether or not there are other elements, such as financial aid and financial need, that may come as a way to sort of circumvent the efforts around race and identity. For international students and scholars, I think oftentimes we forget that the intersection with international students is quite acute here when we're talking about race in the United States. And there are, I think, three ways that we might be able to look at the way that these rulings could influence international student and scholar services. One is that recruitment for diversity to increase diverse student participation in higher education generally may take a pivot towards international. We've seen this in the past where institutions that may have difficulty attracting domestic diversity turn towards international students as a way to diversify their campuses. And this is something that may end up exacerbating efforts to make higher education more accessible to domestic diverse communities. The other way that recruitment kind of comes into play here is that we may see that international students may be making the decision not to come to the United States because they see that some of the policies or the climate of higher education in the United States is not hospitable to folks from their region. And what we may see is international students choosing other markets of higher education, Canada, Europe, Australia, China, and other areas as opportunities for higher education rather than the United States. And this, from a purely economic standpoint, could impact a lot of institutions who rely on international student recruitment. From the individual student perspective, I would just emphasize that belonging is an important and critical aspect here. We can't remove the fact that international students, whether or not they identify as a racial minoritized population in the United States, will not be racialized in the United States, because we know that those systems affect everybody who comes into play with them. So we may see elements of campus climate, tokenization of international students or anybody with a visible racialized identity on campus become more acute. Particularly as domestic diversity enrollment numbers may diminish. So for international student and scholar, for those of you who are working in international student support, this also could be something that that becomes very important to consider. For global learning at home, I would just focus on two areas where this might we might see some impact happening, and one is related to curriculum. Fanta mentioned already that international education at its core focuses on engaging with difference. And there may be an element here of programming, whether it's globally focused programs or programs that focus on intercultural competence, may come under closer scrutiny, depending on how the language and the wording is oriented. And with faculty, there are a number of institutions that rely pretty heavily on international faculty to support their ranks. And with the increase of online learning, lots of international faculty work at our institutions. So there is an element here where we may see diminishing faculty opportunities to talk about their own experiences of international and global opportunities. So global learning at home and internationalization efforts are not sort of excluded from some of the impact that we may see. Finally, the fourth pillar that I mentioned to you, the organizational management and belonging, which really focuses on the folks who make up the field of international education and exchange, may also may see some ramifications later on down the line. The United States legal system works on precedent, and what we've already seen in the aftermath of the SCOTUS decision are efforts underway to target faculty tenure, hiring and promotion, and other very human resources related topics with institutions of higher education. So what I suspect we'll also start to see here are challenges to the ways that we've approached hiring and recruitment in the past. And what that may mean as sort of another venue for, if we're thinking about recruitment again, attracting diverse faculty and professionals to work, not just at the institutions that we work for, but even in pushing folks who may otherwise consider international education as a prospective career path may get harder. And what we've already seen, and this happened shortly on social media platforms, particularly X, formerly known as Twitter, with the faculty channels saying that there are new faculty, particularly diverse faculty who are and staff who are now making decisions about location that emphasize whether or not institutions have made a public commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and whether or not the states where they were potentially considering going to work, places like Florida and Texas, may now be off the table because they may not see themselves represented in the culture or the climate of the campuses where they will be attending. So those are some framings that I wanted to add. I think just a couple of closing notes here is that the implementation and interpretation of these efforts is going to vary widely from campus to campus. We've already seen this, even in states with the same language coming out of policy, the interpretation and application of what that means at the institutional level has varied very extensively. So I would encourage you all, just as Twee has modeled for us, is to actually go back and read what this means for our institutions and how our legal teams are interpreting it in terms of what that means for the application at your institution. There are a couple of other things that I think I'll save for a little bit later, and I'll turn it back over to you, Fanta, but I just wanted to frame that as a direct translation into international education, in part because I think a lot of folks in our field tend to say, oh, well, that's a DE&I related issue, and we know that those things, there's a lot of cross-pollination and overlap between them. And again, if we're looking at the charge of international education from the outset, we are dealing with engaging with difference, and that is also at the core of equity and inclusion work as well. So again, thank you, Fanta, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you for really the framework that you're providing along with Twee. I think that is helpful. And I think there's what you both have reflected is the difference between intent and impact. Right? We know what the legal intent has been, but we also see already what some of the potential impact, and we're going to get to the conversation and already the question that was asked would, and if I come from a state where we have the DEI ban, what do we do? How do we in many ways support the entities who are directly sort of in the crossfires of that and so forth? So we'll get a chance to talk more about that. I also wanted to make sure that we all understand that we have the SCOTUS decision that is looking at race. We also, the DEI bans are not only about race. They're about LGBTQ, they're about trans. It's really writ large. And we would be remiss if we didn't understand the full picture of who are the folks who are in the throes of this. So I just wanted to flag that very early in our conversation, particularly around the DEI ban with Florida and other places as well. Lenitra, you're a professor, you're also happen to be in that discipline where it's about truth telling in ways that sometimes can be, in the crosshairs of things. Talk to us from an academic perspective about what this means, and to someone who's been in the field for a long time.
Thank you, Fanta. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be on this panel. And the first thing I want to do is thank the amazing NAFSA staff for everything they're doing behind the scenes to make this event happen. And I also really want to thank our NAFSA members for coming out to be part of this really important discussion. As Lily said, DEI and international education are not two separate buckets. They're one and the same. And I can see from the participant list, lots of different regions are being represented, but also just from conversations I've had with you over the course of the last year or two, that this is something that you really care about, that you want to make your campuses a better place, that you want your students to have the best opportunities possible. And so I'm so happy that you've come out, and I can't wait to hear your questions. Just a little bit about me personally. I'm a Californian. I was born and raised in San Bernardino, California. And so most of, if not all of my higher education experience was shaped by Prop 209 and the sense of belonging that one feels or does not feel when you're on a college campus and people are constantly telling you that you don't belong. So they look at the color of your skin and they assume that you're only there because of affirmative action. So the repressive legalism that Twee spoke about and that she mentioned at the beginning is a real thing. It really does affect what our students' experience is like. And that has long-reaching effects in terms of what students do on campus, in terms of how they feel as alumni when they graduate. How would you feel if you felt like you were marginalized and didn't have access to the same opportunities? Would you be inclined to donate and support your institution later? Probably not. So there's a lot of long-term implications for how we are able to support and create a high-quality higher education experience for all of our students. Now, for me, my parents came to California from the segregated South. So they came from Alabama and South Carolina. My parents had to pay poll taxes in order to be able to vote, and they had to take a literacy test. So this is just one generation removed from that era. So we are not very far away from a time in which white supremacy reigned supreme and really terrorized people in their daily lives. So, I feel as though much of my family's history has been constantly peering over the gate into higher education and wanting that access and have it to be denied. And I'll say that I believe that, this lack of opportunity and this concerted effort to deny certain people access to higher education is a multi-tool of white supremacy. It serves a variety of purposes in keeping people out of opportunities that allow them economic mobility, allow them to build social capital, and allow them to fully participate in our civic life. So it is critical that we think about and work together to find different ways to combat these efforts. Now, as a scholar, I study art of the African diaspora and where it intersects with the Jewish diaspora. So I have this very international approach to African American studies. And for the last year and a half, I have been running an African American Studies program at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. So I'm not too far away from Lilly here in Northern Virginia. George Mason University is a very large public institution in the state of Virginia. We're in Northern Virginia. And as such, there's great opportunity for students in this region, but there is also still a very deep history of racism and segregation. And so it is very important, in my view, and in the view of the African American Studies program, that all students understand the history of human enslavement, of segregation, of the efforts to integrate here in the Northern Virginia area. And so our program and our curriculum really tries to foster that deep introspective look on history. So, we've really been working hard to develop a program that we hope will one day become a full-blown major at our institution. And that is extremely challenging to do as you see national efforts to denigrate African American studies, both at the secondary school level, but also on university campuses. So we are really swimming against the tide as we are continuing to assert that this knowledge is crucial to understanding American history. And as many of you are aware, earlier this year, the AP African American Studies curriculum was launched, and then there was lots of controversy with politicians in Florida trying to interfere with the curriculum. And this type of activity directly affected what we were doing on our campus as we were trying to develop and design our own major curriculum. So as we were working on this and realizing and seeing what was happening nationally, I drew on my NAFSA resources and my tools of advocacy that I've honed and developed as a NAFSAN, and decided that I was not going to try to do this and take this on by myself. So I reached out to other African American Studies directors in the state, and we formed our own advocacy group. So our group came together to talk about different experiences that we're having in different parts of the state, how do state level laws affect what we're doing on our campuses, and how we can work together to share curricular resources. We reached out to the PEN America Foundation at the recommendation of another NAFSA board member. And PEN America came in and really helped us connect to the national movements to combat these types of initiatives. And so really being able to connect and realize that individually we can do something, but collectively we can do much more was a NAFSA value and a NAFSA skill that has really helped me in advocating for African American studies and its centrality to an American higher education curriculum. So we've been just working as a group, meeting, thinking about how this different legislation is going to affect what we do. So that's a really big part of what I do as an administrator and faculty member, but I'm also still at heart an international educator. And so I'm thinking about how to ensure that my African American studies students, my majors and minors, have access to the transformational education abroad opportunities that we all know change lives, create activists, create better citizens. So I'm fundraising for scholarship dollars for students. And so I'm right there with many of you thinking about how can I create opportunities that support students that can withstand scrutiny or withstand challenges and things that will be able to be lasting and enduring. So for the work that I do, most of my opportunities are available to any student who is an African American studies major or minor. And I'm out recruiting those students broadly. Anybody of any background, of any race, of any identity can major in African and African American studies. And so our programs are designed to support any student who embarks on the study of the Black experience. That being said, there's never a guarantee in the work that we're doing that what you're doing today is going to be, left alone, not challenged, not scrutinized. So, we are very much aware of this. We are very much in touch with, our legal support services on campus. And I would encourage everybody else on this call to think of that as well. And so just as I wrap up before we move on to other questions, I'll say that, as a scholar of African and African American studies, one of the tenets of the discipline is that revolutions are not linear. They do not move forward in a straight line and always move forward and never move back. We know that the way that revolutions work is you take one step forward and you might take 2 steps back, and then you might take 3 steps forward. So to recognize that pattern is important historically in order to be able to interpret events and understand them, but it's also important for us as advocates so that we are not frustrated when this happens, that we are undeterred when we see this. We keep working together. We keep putting our heads down and making sure that our students have what they need. The way that white supremacist thinking works is that it tries to throw you off balance. It tries to scare you. It tries to make you question who you are and your worth. And so if we understand that that's part of what that structure is, it makes it much easier for us to move through that noise and cut through that noise so that we can focus on the task at hand, which is supporting our students and scholars. So that's what I'll leave you with, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
No, thank you, Lenitra. And I think the message there that is important, and we're going to get back to that, is we cannot afford to be deterred, because in being deterred, we would allow the other side to win. And that's exactly what the aim is. And so we've been down this road on lots of different pieces. We have tools that are available to us now, particularly around communication tools and other tools to mobilize perhaps in a way that may be different. I'm not going to assess whether it's better or not, but it's different. With that said, the other piece that I want to do is jump right into the questions and conversations. When I was putting together this panel, I have many CDOs across, particularly the South. I know many of the CDOs who are working at institutions in the South, and I knew that we couldn't really bring them onto the panel, one, because it just wasn't fair to expose them to what we know is a risk. and to have their voices. They have a lot to say and they have a lot to teach us, but they're under climate that they just simply know is not safe. And I appreciated a member of our audience saying, I'm asking this question anonymously because I know what is at risk, and read for us what the statement actually says around what violations would be if they were to work around those, etc. So can we jump into each one of you perhaps providing a tool? If you're from one of those states that has this DEI ban and the numbers keep going up as we speak, right? What tools would you advise people? What tools do you think are out there that can really help us kind of not only make sense of this, but really act as, to counter these forces that we're seeing coming at us every single day? Tui, we'll begin with you in this case.
Well, there's a saying my mother often says to me in Vietnamese is "Khéo ăn thì no, khéo co thì ấm," which is, if you're smart and resourceful in the way you eat, you will be full. If you're smart and resourceful in the way you curl up, you will be warm. And it's that notion of being resourceful and smart, right? And with the tools. And so that's what I did. I took a look at the tools in California. And in some ways, with Prop 209, it affected on issues of race and gender. And it says no preferential treatment or discriminate against preferential treatment for people based on race and in public education, public contracting, and public employment. So when Lily was talking about the hiring, people are now going into the analysis of hiring. That was our case too, 25 years ago. So I think this framework can really help people. And so I looked at all the tools, right? And I looked at the court cases. I looked at all the additional tools, even though some tools are being taken away. There have been added tools throughout the years of research and scholarship in the work. And so as I looked at it, I said, let me kind of organize these tools so that we can khéo co thì no, khéo ăn thì no thì khéo co thì ấm, right? Type. And so this is what I came up for California. And in many ways, it's helpful for colleagues in other states. And be mindful, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Michigan close to 25 years ago, the Michigan then passed a proposition that is very similar to Prop 209. So, just because the pendulum, right, that we're talking about, the two steps, one step forward, one step back type of situation. So what I wrote for USC Race and Equity Center is, how can colleges still make progress toward racial equity in light of today's legal climate? And what I had put in place is the tool framework. I organized it as the legal and the policy. And from the legal standpoint, I took a look at all the analysis of the Supreme Court decision, and then I kind of paralleled it to the Proposition 209 RY. And, Fanta, you used the term our value proposition. That's what I call, what's your RY? Why are we doing this? And, for what it's worth, the Supreme Court decision with Harvard and UNC, their argument about the compelling interest was that there was not enough research and scholarship to prove the compelling interest. So lean in, we're higher ed, right? Lean in, do more research in that. That'll be very interesting where the military academy, there have been a lot of research around integrated militaries and having officers that are also racially diverse, right? To lead an integrated military. So lean in. Then after the notion of compelling interest is race neutral. And so we talked about some of the race neutral ideas, right? Lily and Lenitra spoke to some of them, and I'll go through it a little bit, but here are some race neutral, at least in the California, right? Low income status, right? Basic needs issues, placement of transfer level courses. These are all very anti-racism types of efforts, but they're race neutral, right? Because it's not on its face race. Dual enrollment. I'm a big advocate of dual enrollment in terms of closing racial student success gaps, and guided pathway, which is a national effort, right? So all of these are race neutral. Now, I do want to do a little quick caveat, footnote on this. the courts may call it race neutral, but we know there's really no such thing, right?
Yes.
At the same time, right? Because
Yes.
race neutral is within a context of a white canvas, right? It's just like I explain to people, when you're painting and you're coloring that canvas, if you take out the colors, it's still a white canvas, and that's a color, right? So there's whiteness in the way we operate, but nevertheless, from a legal standpoint, it's race neutral, right? And then the structural. So when I talk about the policy, I talk about looking at things at the structural level, and then looking at the laws, systems, and then looking at things at a cultural level, things that we do, like first gen, celebrations of first gen, right? That's race neutral. First gen being, you know, where both of your parents did not go to college or finish college. And then at the individual level, there are many abilities for people at the individual level to do race neutral work that actually closes racial equity gaps, right? There's been a lot of conversation around ungrading, open educational resource textbooks by faculty to choose that mechanism, et cetera. So then, you know, at the same time, I'm of the firm belief, if you want to close racial equity gaps, if you want to do promote racial equity, you have to, at one point, if not throughout, be race conscious and race based. You have to do that. There many people use the term proxies with the race neutral, low income, et cetera. But you know, if you've really done deep in many of the research around these proxies, so to speak, they really do not do. And California made a point to demonstrate that in its amicus brief, the UC system, in the Harvard case, to say how much racial diversity dipped, even though it went through all the other elements, like, you know, low income status, et cetera, the top 10, top 12% of students at all high schools, et cetera, and still it was not able to achieve its diversity. It's only recently during the pandemic shelter in place, and I have to say, also its elimination of the SAT. So that really had started to make a dent around racial diversity. So, you know, this notion of race conscious. And so here are some examples of race conscious in terms of longitudinal study of hiring pools. So Lily, you talked about hiring and faculty and tenure and so forth. And there's been some questions around, you know, hiring and scholarships and so forth like that. There's much work around this notion of equal employment opportunity, which is EEO, right? So it's pivoted. It's not necessarily DEI type of work, even though that covers EEO, but it's EEO, but this is EEO work. This is make sure your institution does not discriminate, right? And afford people equal employment opportunities. And that is very much still law federally, right? So there's much work there. Culturally, a lot of conversations. Lenitra, you talked about your Africa and African American Black Studies program and the Black experience, how it's open to everyone. California is still able to have UMOJA programs, Cuenta program, because it is open to everyone, even though it has a very clear race conscious programming, right, in its work. So there's still a lot that can be done. And then at the individual level around unconscious bias. So once again, I put in the framework, the tool, the legal and the policy, and looking at policy at the structural, cultural, and individual level. So if you get a chance, take a look at the report. It could give you the framework, even in states where you may be. There are 9 other states besides California that have Prop 209 types of law, right? Including Texas, which was one of the comments made. And some of these bans on DEI have a flavor of those initiatives too. So this framework can still give you a really good guidance for it. Mind you, I'm not giving legal advice. It's still very important because you're at different states to really check in with your folks, but see if this framework can give you some direction and tools.
Thank you, Tui. Lenitra, maybe you can speak to the issue of allyship, because you talked a little bit about that in coming together and also utilizing the tools of PEN America, which is a really important resource. And we will provide a list of resources, that will be on the website that would include all of these that we've talked about, because we really need to arm ourselves with the tools. And we need to not only understand those tools, but we need to understand how we can apply those. So I think, can you talk a bit about where does allyship fit in? If you're in the international ed space and your colleagues who are in the DEI space, or in the case of, programs that are in these states where they're literally being chased down, what does allyship look like for all of you? And what, and how can people really navigate what I call authentic allyship?
Thanks. I think that's a really great question. As international educators, we're talking a lot about allyship. When we're sending students abroad, we want them to support each other during their education abroad experience. And so the same lessons apply to us as professionals. We need to be there for each other. I can't tell you how valuable it is for me to be able to pick up the phone and call someone who understands what I'm going through and isn't necessarily there to solve the problem, but is there to listen and just to let me vent and sound off. That is one way that you can be helpful. If you agree to, listen to somebody who's working in one of those states who's just having a bad day, it just feels like they're under attack from all directions, be their lifeline. Be that person who can just sit there and let them talk and be a welcoming and listening ear. That's one level of allyship. Another level is what has been discussed already, and what I've mentioned is connecting yourself to these national movements to amplify your voice. So I just really want to give a huge shout out to PEN America, because they came to us, they gave us a lot of great information, they connected us to the right people, and really helped us to really take our statewide movement and think about how it connected nationally. And so that was a really helpful step for us. Once we realized what were the challenges for us at the state level, how we could get ideas from people in other states. So to build that network of allies across the country was critical. The other thing I'll say for people on your campuses is that sometimes I'm surprised when I hear that education abroad offices are not always connecting with their area studies programs on campus. That's a really easy way to connect with the type of students we're trying to reach, and to market your programs in a race neutral way. So if anybody is, interested in participating and majoring in one of these area studies disciplines, there should be some pipeline for them to be able to get to know what you're doing in your office. And, I'll take this time to give a huge shout out to my George Mason University GEO colleagues, because my African American Studies room is literally across the hall from the Global Education Office. So I can see them, and I hop across the hallway all the time, and they come over into my space for events. We've hosted international delegations in our Black Studies office. And so it's been a fantastic partnership for our students to get to know what they do and for them to understand what we're doing. So go to your area studies offices, go to your African American studies offices. They feel your pain and vice versa. These are natural allies, and everyone is so siloed and feeling like they're under attack that sometimes when you get that bunker mentality, you can't really lift your head up and see, where you can get help. So really take that time to go and introduce yourself and to declare yourself as somebody who's open to being a supporter and an ally. Find out what's on their minds and tell them what your concerns are, and see if you can't find some ways to partner. I think that that's a really important way for students to see different departments and offices working together. It gives them a sense of comfort that offices really do care about them, and they really are trying to work together to creatively provide a quality higher education experience. So those are a few of the things I would recommend.
Thank you. Lily, I'm going to send it to you. And also, as you talk about allyship, I think there were two questions that came in that I want to kind of also have you kind of consider. One is what I call the system failure in the K through 12, and this idea that it doesn't start early enough and that becoming a problem that we then inherit in higher education was one of the things that came up. The other thing that also came up was really, how do we continue to engage in these topics when the word even diversity can be really mentioned and has become now sort of taboo in lots of different ways. So maybe you can speak to the allyship in those pieces.
Yeah, of course. There are a couple of things that I would start with. I'm not going to lean in too heavy on the partnerships because I think Lenitra and Tweed mentioned very explicitly, if you're not partnering with people or reaching out to different departments or stakeholders, this is the first place where you need to start. So that's one. There you have lots of resources at your institutions, whether you realize it or not, that can help start these conversations on how to respond, including your legal services office and legal departments, where you can actually vet to see if something is violating what the guidance is that you're receiving from the institution and from the state. So I would start there. One thing that I also want to reemphasize is that we are all here because of the students. And if we are not engaging students, we are missing an entire population of people who are directly impacted and affected by these policies. And I like to use the analogy of how many DE&I offices came to be on campuses. A lot of institutions now, I think, have a little bit of amnesia or memory that is a little bit not accurate in terms of how many of these multicultural services and diversity, equity, inclusion offices have come to be. Most of the time, they've come to be because students demanded it, not because the institutions decided out of the goodness of their institutional will that this would be a good approach to student services. So if you are not engaging your students, this is a missed opportunity for you, because students will often have a voice and they can voice things that you cannot. I used to work at an institution. Let's just say the student's email that went to the president got a whole lot more attention when they were saying it than perhaps the way that I said it. So I would just emphasize that students are we need to recenter the students in this conversation, because ultimately they are the ones that are at the core of this discussion. And we need to be engaging them in the conversations and how it is that we approach these things. There are, I think, a couple of other items that I would mention. One is that one of the questions that came in was specifically related to identity resources and how it is that we talk about identity in international contexts and that kind of thing in a way that still gets at the fact that diversity, equity, inclusion are important. And one of the things that I would emphasize here is that identity, regardless of what identity it is, you could be holding a dominant identity here in the United States that could become a very different identity abroad that becomes a health and safety policy issue. And this is, I was having a conversation with a colleague just earlier today in Texas, who is very strategically using language around health and safety and identity preparation for students who are looking to go overseas. If you do not talk about gender, if you do not talk about religion, if you do not talk about race in the context of education abroad, you are leaving your institution open to liability on the ground when the students are coming back and experience harassment, discrimination, violation, any number of other things. So it is very much a health and safety initiative as well, from the education abroad standpoint. One other thing that I would emphasize is that education abroad, and I'm going to lean in here with what Tui mentioned about research. There is lots of research that suggests education abroad is a high impact practice and is used as a tool for retention and student success. And what are institutions' missions ultimately to do? To get students graduated and into careers. So to the extent that you can tie the work that it is that you're doing around diversifying student populations and that kind of thing, thinking about it from the standpoint of race neutrality, how do we make sure that all students on our campus have the ability to participate in programs that will ultimately help them in their academic preparation, in their academic success, and ultimately graduate, will speak the language of university administrators. So to the extent that you can lean into that narrative, and again, much of the research suggests that students from underrepresented and minoritized populations tend to have better outcomes after they come back from study abroad. We really need to utilize that as an opportunity to reemphasize that this is not just a nice to have a resource. One other thing that I think is important here, and this is, complements some of the comments that Lenitra and Tui have already mentioned, is that there's a lot that we can be proactive on already. And we can show and demonstrate good allyship by proactively looking at the things that we're doing in international education to be more accessible to folks who may otherwise be coming from positions of DE&I on their campuses. One of the things that I've seen some offices start to look at is reassess the language that they use around intercultural competencies, international experiences, and scope that out to look at how you can incorporate language that may otherwise be utilized in DE&I offices, right? How can you make sure that the competencies that you're looking at and the experiences that you're looking for in your hiring processes, because as many of you have communicated, there are lots of openings on campuses now in international offices, make that more accessible to our colleagues who may now find themselves without a home on campus? How do we make it easy for folks to transition into positions that may have similarly yoked areas of interest? So I think there are some things that we can be proactive about. From the point of scholarships and fellowships, I will say that they're having managed several nationally competitive fellowship awards. Many of the federally funded programs have been explicit about not being able to use race, national origin, or other types of criteria in their selection process. Now, some of them obviously require US citizenship, so that would be something that I would punt back to your legal department about whether or not that is included here. But many of them are open in terms of their selection criteria, and there might be models for how it is that our federal programs have been used to assess how you can adjust the language of your selection criteria and the scholarship processes to be more open and still, as Tui mentioned, lean into the fact that you can be race conscious and also still be within the framework of the legality of it. I would, this is not legal advice, so you should definitely consult your legal team on campus for that, but that is an important piece. And to get at this question of pipeline, which I will say in conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is often the tendency to say, well, this issue starts much sooner than what I have purview over. And that may be true. And there are lots of other stakeholders that you can involve and connect with to develop creative programming around interventions of people who are working at earlier levels of the pipeline, right? And there are some examples, I think, from the California context where institutions were very mindful of the programs that they were partnering with at the high school and the middle school levels to invest in local communities. Our housing policies, as my code switch, my favorite podcast, Code Switch, will often say, our housing policies generally are also race policies. So if you are micro-targeting the types of institutions and feeder programs that your institution is looking at, and again, connecting with your admissions offices to make sure that these are priorities, finding creative ways to target those communities in a way that does get at the pipeline issue and still is focused on your programming, because ultimately the research also suggests the earlier you reach students with interests in international opportunities, the more likely they are to get involved later on down the line. And they have to hear it multiple times. One time is not going to be enough. So to the extent that you can, again, partner with the stakeholders who are working at earlier intervention points and finding ways to be creative about how you support them, providing your peer advisors or your peer ambassadors to go speak at some of the recruitment opportunities that your admissions office is doing. This is a great way to have those shared connections. So I would emphasize that it feels really hard. And if you take a step back to do some really close reading about what's there, sometimes what it is that we're interpreting may actually leave a little bit more room. One of the things that I think is unique about many of these policies really going hard on diversity, equity, and inclusion is that gives us an opportunity to look at the language and reassess the language that we're using, right? And we saw this happen in the 80s and the 90s in the move away from multiculturalism to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
So what I suspect will happen is that our language is going to adjust to the context in which we find ourselves now, which will perhaps in some cases actually render some of these policies moot because we are no longer using the policies, the language that the policies were framed around. So I think we have lots of opportunities to think creatively here. I tend to be a little bit more glass half full, even though the pragmatist in me says, maybe not half full, but definitely not on the lower end type of perspective. And I would say that the status quo for where we were before wasn't working for the majority of students, wasn't working for the majority of faculty and staff anyway. So why not use this as an opportunity to really jar us out of our comfort with the status quo and use this disruption to be productive in what it is that we ultimately are aiming to achieve.
And thank you for reminding us of that. And I think I'm one of those who sees the glass very much more than half full. And I often say with challenges come new opportunities. And I think this is one of those moments where we are in the midst of, I think really, this is definitely a time when we need to galvanize and figure out how do we work and navigate this train that's in front of us. And there are a couple of things that I just wanted to mention that our panelists talked about. One is the language. Language does matter. And in the field of international education, we've had language that is very much, in some ways a synonym to DEI, right? We talk about intercultural competence, right? We talk about cross-cultural. We talk about differences, right? We talk about the importance of knowing the other. There's lots of that is within our nomenclature and our literature that I think has a lot of applicability and so forth. Part of it is we need to kind of come together and have an exchange of ideas around our language. Already we're seeing more and more organizations and entities that are adopting the language of belonging, right? That are moving away from the language of DEI to the language of belonging. And in many ways, it's a bigger tent that it is providing. And it is not necessarily that it is a substitute or to diminish, but rather how do we really think about that bigger tent and what would that look like? Also cross-programming. It is the case that we often tend to function in our universities and the system is designed with that in mind, which is a zero-sum game. In order for I to win, you must lose, right? And there's been this tension that we've seen on our campus between our DEI offices and our global education and our global offices and so forth. And yet here's the irony. I know where I was, students would move from one office to the other because the students knew and understood that they in many ways occupied multiple identities. And that coming to the US, whether you recognize it or not, you were going to be racialized. If you were not racialized, your ethnic identity was going to come to bear. And we saw with 9/11 how religion got into the whole mix of things and so forth. And here is a country that professes to be the beacon of not only hope, but the beacon of democracy and the beacon of academic freedom. And these are direct attack on the essence and the DNA of our institution. And so, yes, PEN America comes at this from the perspective of freedom of expression. We don't have to agree with everything that they do and how they come at it, but they're an important ally in this fight. ACLU, I used to refer my students a lot to ACLU when I was an American because they would come and they wanted tools. They wanted to understand how do you do effective advocacy? What does that look like, etc. And that was important. The other thing is in our international student offices, at least, we speed down our attorneys. Because for anyone who's working in the immigration area, you're generally one of your closest friends is, guess what? Your general counsel office. In our DEI space, that is not necessarily the nature. So we really do need to create more of these engagement with our general counsel's office. And yes, it is the case that some of them are quite conservative in their interpretation. We need to bring them into sort of roundtables that are safe spaces to really engage constructively in like, how do we think about these things? Help us understand, but let's also figure it out together. Those are some of the things that I just wanted to kind of resurface. And then lastly, several of our members have said this, and we can't say this enough. You've got to vote. You've really got to vote. And, we are seeing this and we're looking at some of the data that's coming in around people's perception of civic engagement. We're seeing distrust of institutions. We're seeing all of these things that are pervasive among our students. We are, as educators, really have to spend time with our students on institutions are far from perfect. Let's be clear about that. All of them are far from perfect. But to not vote is actually to vote. And so we've got to use all the tools that are available to us at the individual level, at the cultural level, as was premised, and at the structural level. It has to be a system approach to how we think about this and think about this from an ecosystem perspective. And we've got to move away from the zero sum, and we've got to move away from the binary thinking. that we in international education do this, you in DI do that. And we've got to figure out how we really come together. Because here's the other thing. Today, it's about DEI as domestic. Tomorrow, if we don't keep our eyes on the ball, it will be the international. We have every reason to want to have coalitions on a lot of levels on this. Again, I want to go back to this piece of the states, who are like, we are in this, and this is real. I mean, you use language, you could lose your job. Institutions are advising us to not say anything, to not do anything. You all have talked about language matters and how we do that, how we think about cross-pollination matters, et cetera, and so forth. And we've talked about the importance of voting, the importance of allyship with some of the national organizations. Anything else that you would say is important for our members who are very passionate about this and have a lot of experience in the space of the IE world? What other advice do you have, or things that you would say, here are cautionary tales, right? Tui and Lily talked about this. What we're talking about, we're not providing you legal advice. The sociologist in me is looking at this from a systems approach. You have to engage your general counsel. There is no way around that. But also in engaging your general counsel, you've got to engage your students. Our students are more savvy than we give them credit for. I can assure you of that. Coming from a campus that was incredibly politically active, I can assure you that was my full-time jobs times 10. Anything else? Yes.
Banta, as a former general counsel for a community college district in California, and also the state system general counsel, interim general counsel for the state system office in California. I definitely want to encourage people to connect with their general counsel office and maybe give them my report to give them a sense of, sometimes you need an interpreter between the lawyer and the advocate, so to speak. That said, I want to lean in on your question around allyship and Lily's comment about strategic language. There's just a side note on the cup, a glass half full, glass half empty. I always say that if you put my glass half full or empty in a cup, it's my cup runneth over. So I feel very grateful for my life. And that said, also quite optimistic, but also practical. And the practical part of it is that allyship, right? I'm pro bono legal counsel for the African American Community College Trustees and Administrators Association in California. We're known as the Black Caucus, and we are forming a coalition of several other affinity caucuses and even with the API caucus, because the API community has been used as a wedge around this conversation of in the SCOTUS decision. And the goal is to build that coalition and inspire and inform. And through that coalition building, we can give people a little more courage when they're doing that risk analysis, right? They have a little more courage on this side, right? To do the work. And there's no doubt that it takes a lot of courage to lean into the work. In terms of the strategic language and strategic thought, I want to underscore what Lily was talking about. You'll notice my report is focused on closing student racial success equity gaps. The focus is about student success, right? This is why we do the work. We want and need to promote faculty diversity racially because we want to close the student racial equity gaps, because the research shows that students who are exposed to diverse racially faculty are more likely to succeed. And so succeed in their major, actually major in the major that the faculty of diversity is teaching, et cetera. So there's a lot there. And so having that focus is the language, right? The thought. And then also partly cautionary tale is you'll notice in my report, I talk about how the word affirmative action is also, it's an old term. It was founded in the 60s. It has evolved significantly, even 50 years ago with the Bakke case and years of Supreme Court decisions. So when you have a conversation on affirmative action with people, it usually kind of boils down to a certain level of conversation that doesn't make sense, because that's not what affirmative action even today looks like. And you'll notice the Supreme Court, the majority opinion makes no mention of the word affirmative action. In the concurring opinion with Clarence Justice Thomas even said the so-called affirmative action. So even that language is questionable, right? So and so that's why I have in my report, I called it the equitable protection principle. It gives it a different framework. It looks at it from an equitable standpoint that infuses equal employment opportunities, that infuses anti-racism work. I mean, when you look at the SAT and the desperate impact of the SAT on communities of color, you ask yourself, is that affirmative action? No, it's not. It's a different type of work that's dismantling structural systems, right? And so let's get out of even the language that's not even the right language, right, of what we're trying to do. So that's another sort of cautionary tale that I would have for folks on that.
As we're getting to time, I want to make sure that you all know that we will have the resources that we've talked about. We're going to continue to build. We have on our website a NAFSA, a section on diversity, equity, inclusion, SCOTUS and the bands and so forth. We're going to continue to build on that. There is something about the notion of sharing is caring. If you all have tools that you have utilized or that you're working with, and you wouldn't mind sharing that, we welcome those, because the more we can build our repertoire of tools that are available will be really important. So we want to summarize that and want to make sure that we really are leveraging all of the sort of opportunities that we have there. There was one last thing that I want to talk about. It said, how do we advance this in higher education when you don't have the protection of tenure and promotion? This is where sometimes you have to leverage the privilege that the others have, right? This is what Lenitra was talking about, which is working with your faculty who do have the tenure. And in having the tenure, they too are under siege, let's be clear. But in being under siege, there is much more light that comes to that and heat in that environment where even those who may not agree on DEI will galvanize, because this is really ultimately about academic freedom. And in our campuses, people deeply care about those issues because it is the backbone of the higher education system. So we do need to lean in sometimes on the privilege of our colleagues who are in those spaces, but it needs to be a work of reciprocity and allyship and not feeling disempowered. That's the piece that is important in that. I also, before we finish, so we're going to have those resources. Stay tuned. If you have resources, please share it with us. And we can put, an email where you can share that with us, and we'll make sure we keep working on that. We have a DEI statement that we've had at NAFSA for a long time. We felt that we needed to do our own homework and our own work. So we've been on this journey of revisiting our DEI and statement, and it is here on this site. And we are asking for feedback and input from all of our members up to October. We really need your eyes. We need your insight on this, because this needs to be from all of us and needs to speak from that place. So we're encouraging you to please comment on the draft. We're going to be collecting that. Our board is leading this effort. And then in December, they will basically vote and pass what will be the new statement for NAFSA, because I often say we all have to do this work. There is no way around it. We've got to do the work, but we don't have to do the work alone. We have to do the work together, right? And we all know this. There's an African proverb that I say all the time, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. This is the fight for today. It is not going to be over, but we've got to go together. And we have to have the long view, and history does matter. And there are lessons that we can learn from the past. And there are things that we can try to not repeat if we are more educated about the different components of these as we move forward. So I just want to leave us all to say, this is not the time to despair. Our students need us more than ever. But by the same token, you cannot, in many ways, give what you don't have. You need to exercise self-care. This is hard work, and it's also very tiring work. So your ability, as Lenitra and Lily and Tui and others talked about, you've got to lean on each other in your campuses, outside of your campuses, as you continue to do the work. But ultimately, we are in the education arena because we believe every single one of our students deserve the best quality education they can have, irrespective of socioeconomic, race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, caste, and all of that. We've got to work together to continue. It is hard work. There will be some wins and there will be some moments, that are going to be tough, but we cannot despair.
Bonta, would you mind if I just said something else about the NAFSA diversity statement?
Please. Please.
This statement, I want to thank Dr. Malaika Marable-Serrano for leading this effort. The board is highly engaged in revising the statement, but this is the member statement. This is your statement. And so we really want your input and your feedback on this statement. We highly encourage all of you to take a look at it. And we highly encourage you to provide your honest feedback on it. It's only as strong as the member feedback that we get. So please, please, please take a look at this and give us your feedback. And, I just wanted to say one other thing, as you mentioned about, people leaning on each other. This is such an important moment that we connect as people, and that is partially what NAFSA does, is it's a connector of people. Burnout and apathy are also part of that white supremacist multi-tool. So if we are tired and apathetic and don't care anymore because we've been working too hard and we're overworked, we won't be able to serve our students in the ways in which they deserve. So please take care of yourselves and each other.
Thank you for that. Any last comment from our, from our panelists? Because the other thing I was going to say is, because this work, we don't do it alone. I want to reiterate, we have Diversity Abroad that has been taking this mantle for a very long time and really has been leading. And so I really encourage you all to really make sure that you get educated and know what they're providing along with other organizations. So this is also about a partnership among us as organization. It's incredibly important that we honor that and that we really do that with the level of humility that I think is important for each and every one of us. Twee, you wanted to say something, please.
Well, I just wanted to close out with the parting words, as I often say, I didn't say this part, the unexamined life is not worth living, but I often say the unexamined system is not worth perpetuating. And so we need to really examine the work that we do constantly, whether it's a SCOTUS decision, a ban on DEI or anything like that. Even when it's favorable, we should still be examining our systems and our processes. And in terms of allyship, I can't help but think of the Vietnamese saying, "Bầu ơi, thương lấy bí cùng, tuy rằng khác giống, nhưng chung một giàn," which means, "Oh, melon, please love the gourd. Even though you're from different seeds, you share the same vine." And so I'm grateful to be sharing this virtual vine with all of you and with all the attendees. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. Lily, please.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note, I think this town hall is a good example of collaboration and engagement. We know that we cannot do this work alone. We will be continuing to provide resources as updates come out, similar to like at the end of August, the Biden and Harris administration put out guidance about a letter. We will be adapting that to interpret a bit about how that applies to international education along the way. We expect that they'll be putting something out later this month, so you can expect to see something from us there. And then I do want to just say, as an organization that is not an institution, there is a responsibility that us as outside stakeholders play in providing advocacy and allyship to the institutions that we serve. And you'll see that a lot of the work that we will continue to do will be to help uplift those stories, even if we have to anonymize where it is that they're coming from. We recognize that there's a lot of sensitivity around this work. So if you are interested in bringing forth some ways that you might be getting creative about addressing the challenges that you're confronting on your campus, know that you have resources in Diversity Abroad, and it sounds like NAFSA as well, and others to really push that out. I would like to just offer that space to be able to push out stories of successes that are happening that are not attributed to individuals and institutions, so that others can see that there are efforts that are happening. Because sometimes you, as you all have mentioned, you get in kind of your silo, you forget that you're not the only one that's going through this, and it feels very tiring. So to the extent that we can continue to help build community around this, just want to put that out there. There are lots. I appreciate all of your all's proverbs and comments. I don't have any really deep, thoughtful ones, except for I am, again, this type of conversation makes me excited about the fact that there are people committed to challenging where it is that we are with the status quo.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Lily. And what we will commit to with NAFSA is, as we get resources, we'll make sure we get that to you all. You can determine which ones you want to use or not, so that we have that kind of cross, sort of link of things and so forth. Because the more we all work together, I think the more we're going to get far. But again, I cannot thank you, each and every one of you, enough. I really cannot. You have come at this with head and heart. And I also know that is how our members and how our audience has come at this, is head and heart. So let us make sure we continue down this road. And let us also just recognize that, yes, with hard work, sometimes we have to slow down, but then we have to pick up. Because what we know with this is that history, as Lenitra reminded us, is really not linear. It is cyclical. It is cyclical, and we cannot forget that. But thank you to each and every one of you for everything you do on your campuses, for each other and for your students. Please know that we see that, we understand that, and we want to be your partner, on this journey. And so please remember to reach out. And again, we will continue to pull out as many of the resources as we have, but you all have a lot of knowledge. And so do not hesitate to share what you have. And thanks to each and every one of you. Be safe and have a wonderful start to the semester. I know this is the time of year where it's incredibly uplifting on our campuses. We see new generations of students come. We see generations of students who are at the finish line. And there's nothing more gratifying about what we do. And this is our why. So just remember that, and wishing all of you just a great afternoon, morning, or evening. And then again, to my panelists, thank you. Thank you for really your insights, your knowledge, and for sharing generously of what you know and the work that you've been doing. Thank you for doing that. And to the NAFSA team, thank you for being an incredible team. And to our members, we really, really rely on you for the knowledge, co-creation. And so we appreciate each and every one of you. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, morning, or evening. Thanks to everybody.